The thing about grief was that it had a smell. Ellie had learned that in the weeks after the funeral, the way mourning soaked into wool and linen and the wooden beams of a house, how it settled in curtains and collected in the corners of rooms where a man used to sit. It smelled like cold ash and dried lavender, and something underneath both of those things. Something she had no word for, only the recognition of it each morning when she woke, and the absence beside her was the first thing her body registered before her mind caught up. Thomas had been dead for 7 months. The cottage was hers now. That was what everyone said, as though ownership were a comfort. The cottage is yours, Ellie. The land is yours. You'll be fine. They said it the way people said things they needed to believe, not things they had verified. She was 24 years old, widowed before she'd had the chance to become fully a wife, living on the edge of Ashevale territory, where the pines grew so dense the sunlight arrived in pieces, and the nearest village was a half-morning's walk through mud and root and the particular silence of a forest that belonged to wolves. She did not belong to wolves. That was the other thing people said, usually with a lowered voice and a glance toward the tree line. You know you don't belong here, girl. Human women don't last long on pack borders. Thomas had been human too, a woodcutter, quiet and gentle, with calloused hands and a laugh she'd loved, and he had lasted 31 years before his heart simply stopped one night while she was sleeping beside him. Not wolves, not violence, just the ordinary cruelty of a body that quit without warning. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and because of Bramble. The dog had appeared 3 weeks after the funeral, limping out of the tree line at dusk with a torn ear and ribs she could count from the doorway. He was enormous, some mix of livestock guardian and something wilder, pale gray and white, with eyes the color of winter ice. He should have terrified her. Instead, she'd brought him inside, fed him broth and dried meat, wrapped his paw, and by morning, he'd claimed the space at the foot of her bed as though he'd always lived there. He was not a wolf. She was certain of that. She'd seen pack wolves on the road before. The way they moved, the intelligence behind their eyes, the deliberateness. Bramble was a dog, clumsy and affectionate, and prone to sleeping with his legs in the air. But he was large enough and loud enough that no one bothered her anymore, and she had decided that was sufficient reason to keep him forever. It was Bramble who found the man. The morning had started like all the others. Gray sky, cold air carrying the mineral bite of incoming rain, the fire needing to be coaxed back from its embers. She'd pulled on her heavy wool dress and her worn boots, tied her dark hair back, and taken the basket to gather the last of the late mushrooms from the oak grove north of the cottage. Bramble had gone ahead, as he always did, nose to the ground, tail working in slow sweeps. He stopped at the edge of a shallow ravine where a stream cut through exposed root and stone, and he did not move. That was not like him. Ellie approached carefully, basket against her hip, and looked down. The man was half in the water. He lay face down across the mossy bank, one arm submerged to the elbow, the other flung across a tree root as though he'd grabbed for it, and missed. He was large, absurdly, uncomfortably large, dressed in what had once been a heavy riding cloak of dark charcoal wool, now shredded across the back in long, parallel tiers that could only have come from claws. Beneath the shredded fabric she could see a linen shirt matted with dried blood so deep it had gone black at the edges. And beneath that, through the tears, the pale expanse of a back marked with wounds that should not have been survivable. Bramble whined and looked at her. "I see him," she said. She stood still for a long moment. She was not foolish. A man half dead on the border of pack territory, wearing the remnants of high-quality riding clothes, bearing claw wounds. This was not a situation a sensible woman stepped into without thought. He could be a criminal. He could be a shifter. He could be bait. Then he moved. Just his fingers, the ones resting on the root, a slow curl, as though something in his body was still trying to grip and couldn't quite manage it. And that small, exhausted motion settled the matter for her. She went down the bank. He was breathing, barely. When she pressed 2 fingers to his throat, his pulse came back slow and unsteady, the kind of rhythm that communicated effort rather than ease. His skin was cold in the way that meant hours in low temperatures, not minutes. The wounds on his back had partially closed. Too quickly for a human, she realized. the edges of the deepest tears already knitted with the faint pink of new tissue, and that told her what she'd already suspected. Shifter. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. At the dark hair plastered to his neck. At the breadth of his shoulders, even collapsed as he was. At the hands, which were large and scarred across the knuckles in the way of men who had been in a great number of fights and won most of them. "Bramble," she said, "if he tries to hurt me, I expect you to intervene." Bramble sat down and thumped his tail against the mud. She could not carry him. That was simply a physical fact. He outweighed her by a significant margin, and the bank was steep. What she could do, and did, was pull him far enough from the water that he wouldn't roll back in. Roll him carefully onto his back, check that his airway was clear, and then run. She ran back to the cottage, loaded the small handcart with her heaviest wool blankets and a length of rope, ran back, and spent the better part of an hour doing something she would later describe to no one, because no one would believe a woman her size had managed it. She got him onto the cart. It involved leverage and rope, and a great deal of profanity she'd learned from Thomas. And by the end she was sweating despite the cold, her back aching in a way that promised consequences, and the man had not woken once. She got him inside. She got him onto the bed. Her bed, the only one, which required a similar negotiation with gravity and stubbornness. She cut away what remained of his shirt. She cleaned the wounds with boiled water and the jar of pine resin salve she kept for emergencies. She built the fire until the room was warm enough that the shivers working through him began to slow. She covered him with every blanket she owned and sat in the chair by the hearth with Bramble's head in her lap, watching the rise and fall of the stranger's chest, and tried to think clearly. He was healing faster than he should. Even for a shifter, she had heard they healed quickly, though her direct knowledge was limited. The pace of it seemed extraordinary. The deepest wounds were visibly closing as she watched. The color was returning to his face in slow degrees, revealing features that were severe and still. A strong jaw dark with several days of growth. A nose that had been broken at least once. A brow that even unconscious conveyed some quality she could only describe as command. He was not a common pack member. She understood that with the instinctive certainty of someone who had spent enough time on the margins of a world to recognize its hierarchies from a distance. The quality of what remained of his clothes, the particular kind of scar tissue across his hands. The way even unconscious, even half drowned and shredded, he occupied space with an authority that had nothing to do with consciousness. She didn't know who he was. She knew she had perhaps made a very serious mistake, but he was alive, and warming. And Bramble had fallen asleep pressed against the side of the bed, which the dog had never done with a stranger. And Ellie had learned to pay attention to that. She watched him through the afternoon as the rain arrived and drummed against the small windows, as the fire settled and crackled, as the gray light thickened toward evening. She reheated broth she hadn't intended to make, and didn't understand why she'd made until she found herself sitting on the edge of the bed with it, watching his face for signs of waking, wanting to be useful when it happened. He didn't wake. But near dark, when she was banking the fire for the night and had resolved to sleep in the chair, his breathing changed, deepened. The tension in his jaw eased by a fraction. And Bramble, without lifting his head, moved his tail in one slow, certain wag, the particular wag he reserved for things he had decided were safe. Ellie looked at the stranger in her bed, at the wounds that were almost gone now, the skin smooth and new where hours ago there had been damage that should have killed him. At the hands resting open on the blanket, no longer gripping, no longer straining. She thought about who, in this territory, could be hunted badly enough to end up face down in a freezing stream with claw marks that deep. She thought about the stories people told about the Alpha King, the one who ruled all packs, the one whose name was spoken in Ashvale with a particular lowering of the voice that meant both fear and something adjacent to reverence. She told herself she was being foolish. She went to sleep in the chair. In the morning, she would know. She knew before he opened his eyes. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small details that her mind had been quietly assembling through the night, like a puzzle she hadn't consented to solve, the quality of the leather still buckled at his wrist beneath the shredded sleeve, stamped with a mark she recognized as the royal seal of the high pack. The ring on his right hand, heavy silver set with a black stone, the kind of ring that wasn't decorative but functional. the kind that pressed into wax and left authority behind it, the way Bramble had not once growled, had not once shown the particular stiffness he reserved for threats, but had instead slept curled against the side of the bed like a dog that had recognized something and made its peace with it. She was standing at the hearth reheating water when he woke. She heard the change in his breathing first, the slight catch, the deepening, the quality of air that meant a body moving from unconsciousness into awareness. Then silence, the careful kind. The kind of silence that came from someone taking stock before revealing themselves. Then, low and rough with disuse, the voice. Where am I? Not a question. An assessment delivered in the grammatical form of one. Ellie kept her back to him for 3 more seconds. She needed them. Then she turned. He was sitting up, or attempting to, one arm braced against the headboard, the other pressed to his ribs in a way that told her something there was still knitting together. In the gray morning light, with the fire low and the rain still tapping at the windows, he looked less like a half-drowned man, and more like what she now understood him to be. The face was severe and still composed, even in pain, especially in pain, with eyes so dark they read as black from across the room, and fixed on her with the complete and unsettling attention of someone who processed information very quickly. A cottage, she said, on the northeastern border of Ashvale territory. A pause. His gaze moved from her to the room, cataloging, she realized, measuring exits and threats and variables with the practiced efficiency of a man for whom this was reflex, and then returned to her. You found me. My dog found you. I retrieved you. He looked at Bramble, who was sitting at the foot of the bed with his tail moving in slow sweeps, regarding the stranger with an expression of uncomplicated goodwill. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in the man's face. You're human, he said, thoroughly. You brought a shifter into your home. I brought an injured man out of a freezing stream, Ellie said. I try not to let politics complicate basic decency. She kept her voice even. She was proud of that. Internally, she was aware of her heart beating in a register slightly above its usual pace, and she was managing that the way she managed most things, by giving it no outward expression, and continuing to move. She poured hot water into the clay mug, added the dried herbs she'd measured out, brought it to the bedside table. Drink that. It's willow bark and nettle. Your ribs aren't fully healed and the willow will help. He looked at the mug, then at her. You know what I am, he said. There was no point in pretending otherwise. I have a reasonable suspicion, she said, about what you are. I don't know who you are. I haven't decided whether I want to. That landed differently than she'd intended. Less careful, more honest, and she watched him receive it. He reached for the mug. His fingers, she noticed, were steady. Whatever pain he was in, it didn't reach his hands. Kyle, he said. Just the name. No title, no rank, no formal introduction. She had the distinct sense that he was testing something, watching to see what the name did to her face. She kept her face neutral through an act of significant will. She knew that name. Everyone on pack borders knew that name. Kale, the Alpha King, the Lord of all packs, the man who had united the fractured territories under a single authority through a combination of strategy and force that the stories rendered differently depending on who was telling them. In Ashvale, they called him the Iron Sovereign. The pack elders spoke of him the way people spoke of weather, as something powerful and impersonal that you prepared for rather than argued with. He was currently sitting in her dead husband's bed, drinking willow bark tea, with her dog's chin resting on his knee. Ellie, she said, because it seemed only fair. Ellie, he repeated, as though filing it carefully. You're the widow, the woodcutter's wife. She went still. You know of me. I know of this cottage. I've passed through this border before. He paused. I'm sorry for your loss. It was plainly said without ornament, and that plainness made it land harder than any elaborate condolence. She turned back to the fire to have something to do with her face. How long was I down? He asked. I found you yesterday morning. It's dawn now. She turned back. Someone hunted you. It wasn't a question either. She was learning his register, his jaw tightened by a fraction. Yes. In your own territory. Yes. She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat, because her legs were tired, and she had decided that fear, while reasonable, was not going to be useful to either of them. The wounds were from claws, large ones, more than one animal. She folded her hands in her lap. You don't have to tell me anything. But I'd like to know whether whatever hunted you is likely to follow a trail to this cottage, because that affects certain decisions I need to make today. He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face, picking out the lines of exhaustion beneath the control, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of more than one night without sleep. They believe I'm dead, he said finally. Are you certain? No. She nodded slowly. Then I need to know if there's anyone I can send word to, someone you trust. Because you're not well enough to travel yet. Another day at minimum before those ribs will hold on horseback, and I have no interest in being found harboring the Alpha King without at least one person aware of where you are. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly. He didn't seem like a man who surprised easily. But a recalibration, as though he had arrived with a set of expectations about what a human widow on pack borders would be, and was quietly revising them. There is one man, he said. My second. Davin, he'll be looking. Tell me how to reach him. He told her. A location, a particular messenger route through the village, a phrase that would identify the message as genuine. She memorized it, because she had always had a good memory, and because she understood instinctively that writing it down was a risk. I'll go this morning, she said, standing. There's broth on the fire, bread on the table. Don't try to stand. The floorboards creak and I'll know. She paused. I'm serious about that last part. For the first time, something altered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the shadow of one, brief and controlled, like something he'd decided against at the last moment. Understood, he said. She went. The walk to the village was cold and wet. The path turned to soft mud by 2 days of rain, the pines on either side dripping steadily. Bramble had tried to follow her, and she'd pointed back at the cottage door with the particular gesture that meant stay. And he had. Which told her something. Because Bramble obeyed that gesture only when he'd decided the thing inside was worth guarding. She delivered the message. She bought provisions. More than she'd intended. Enough for 2 people for several days. Which she noted as a decision she'd made without quite making it. She walked back through the cold morning with the basket heavy on her arm, and her mind doing the thing it did when she was unsettled, turning over details with a restless, grinding precision. He was the Alpha King. He was in her bed, healing, because someone within his own ranks had tried to kill him. That was the only explanation for claw wounds that deep, that coordinated. A challenge from within, a betrayal from close range. She understood betrayal from close range. She understood waking up and finding that the world had redrawn itself overnight without asking. She understood the particular cold clarity that came after, the way grief and shock eventually distilled into something harder and more useful. She understood it perhaps better than he expected a human widow to. When she came back through the door, he was exactly where she'd left him, sitting up against the headboard, the empty mug on the table. He had found the secondary blanket folded at the foot of the bed, and pulled it across his lap. He looked somewhat less like a man about to make a poor decision with his ribs. Bramble was across his feet, fully asleep, snoring lightly. Kale looked up when she entered. His gaze went to the basket, then to her face. Reading her the way she was beginning to understand, he read everything, quickly, thoroughly, without announcing the conclusion. The message is sent, she said, setting the basket on the table. We have perhaps a day before your second arrives if he moves fast. She began unpacking the provisions. Until then, you're a traveler who came off his horse in the storm. That's all anyone in the village needs to know. A pause. Why are you doing this? He asked. She didn't look up from the basket. You were in the water. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. She set the bread down, then the wrapped cheese, then the small bundle of dried herbs. My husband used to say that you find out who you are in the moments when it's inconvenient to be decent. I've been trying to figure out who I am for 7 months. She finally looked at him. You're an inconvenient test case. But here we are. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had weight and texture, that meant something was being received rather than ignored. Outside, the rain eased. Inside, the fire settled with a soft collapse of burning wood. Brambles snored, and Kale, the Alpha King, lord of all packs, hunted and half-dead 2 days ago, looked at the human woman moving quietly around her small cottage and said nothing at all, which, she would later understand, was how he expressed the things that mattered most. Davin arrived the following morning before the mist had cleared. Ellie heard the horse first, a single animal, moving fast on the path from the village, then slowing as it approached the cottage, the rider clearly doing what careful men did when approaching unknown ground. She was already at the window when Bramble lifted his head from the floor, ears forward, body still. Not a threat posture, confirmation. She opened the door before the knock. The man outside was compact and dark, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the kind of face that had been arranged by years of controlled expression into something unreadable by default. He wore a riding cloak with the hood pushed back, his horse steaming lightly in the cold air behind him, and he looked at Ellie with eyes that were doing the same rapid cataloging she'd already learned to recognize in his king. "The hearth burns east," he said. The phrase Kale had given her. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside and saw Kyle sitting at the table, upright, dressed in the spare shirt she'd found in Thomas's old chest. Too short in the sleeves and slightly too broad for him, but clean, with the mug of tea she'd insisted on between his hands. And something passed across Davin's face that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. He crossed the room in 4 steps and gripped Kale's forearm in the way she understood was a warrior's greeting. And Kale returned it without standing, because she'd told him firmly that morning that he was not standing until she said so, and he had, after a pause that communicated resistance without voicing it, agreed. She busied herself at the hearth, giving them space, but the cottage was small, and she heard everything. 3 days, Davin said, low. We found the site, found the blood. A pause that had weight in it. I thought. I know, Kale said. How many? 4. Coordinated. A pause. Aldrich. The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Ellie kept her face toward the fire, and her hands steady on the pot she was pretending to tend. Davin's exhale was slow and controlled. You're certain? I caught his scent before the second hit. He was directing, not fighting. He wanted it to look like a border ambush. Kale's voice remained even throughout, which she was beginning to understand was not composure in the ordinary sense, but something more deliberate. The kind of steadiness that was actively maintained, a choice made continuously rather than a condition. He'll have reported to the council that I've gone missing on the northeastern border. By now, he'll be managing the narrative. He's already called an emergency session, Davin said. Positioning himself as acting authority pending confirmation of your... He stopped, pending your return. How many on the council know what he is? Unknown. He has 2 firm allies that I can identify. The rest are waiting to see which way the weight falls. Ellie set 2 bowls on the table without being asked, and went back to the hearth. She heard the brief pause, the slight shift of attention, and then the conversation resuming in the slightly lower register of men who had acknowledged a presence and decided to trust it. She noticed that. She decided not to examine it yet. I need 3 days, Kale said. 4 at most. Then I return and I walk into that council chamber, and I let every person in that room see that I am alive and that I know exactly what was done. You're not ready in 3 days. I will be. Kale, I will be, he said again, and the repetition was not emphasis. It was conclusion. Davin was quiet for a moment, then, there's something else. She heard the shift in his voice, the particular quality of a man preparing to deliver information he didn't want to carry. Mira is at the capital, Davin said. She arrived 2 days ago. Aldrich brought her. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She came willingly? Kale's voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but something beneath the surface of it had altered. Appears so. She's been telling the council you've been unstable, erratic, that she feared for her safety. Another pause. She brought documents, letters, supposedly in your hand, addressing pack lords in language that could be read as preparation for consolidation by force. Forged, obviously. But the council doesn't know your hand well enough to be certain, and Aldrich has 2 members who will swear to authenticity. Ellie refilled the mug she was holding without looking up. She understood now, the full shape of what she'd pulled from the stream. This wasn't a border skirmish or a personal vendetta. This was a coordinated political dismantling. The assassination attempt was only one piece of it. While Kyle was meant to be dead in a frozen creek, his name was already being disassembled in the capital. "Who is Mira?" she asked. Both men looked at her. She met the question with the straightforwardness she'd found was the only register that worked. It was Cale who answered. "My former intended," he said. "The arrangement ended 8 months ago. Her choice or yours?" A slight pause. "Mine." "And she went to Aldrich." "It appears so." Ellie set down the mug and sat across from them both. She folded her hands on the table. "Then you have a problem that isn't just physical. You can heal and ride back to the capital and walk into the council chamber, and Aldrich will have prepared for that. He'll have a secondary plan. The letters are already placed. Mira is already speaking." She looked at Cale. "If you walk in there without a counter-narrative, you give him the moment he needs to make the question of your stability look credible." Davin looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he looked at Cale. Cale was looking at her. "She's right," he said. "I know she's right," Davin said, with the slight weariness of a man accustomed to everyone being right in ways that complicated his work. "The question is what the counter-narrative is." "The letters are forged," Ellie said, "which means someone made them. Which means there's a scribe, a source of the paper, a seal that was copied, a chain of hands the documents pass through. That chain exists." She looked at Davin. "Can you find it?" He studied her for a moment. "Given time." "How much time would you need?" "A week. Perhaps less with the right pressure applied in the right places." "Then Cale needs a week." She turned to Cale. "Which means you need somewhere to be that Aldrich isn't looking. He believes you're dead on this border. He has no reason to send men to a human widow's cottage." The silence was different this time. Not the silence of shock, but of men recalibrating. "You're offering to harbor me," Cale said. "I'm offering to be the least suspicious location in this territory," Ellie said. "There's a difference. One is sentimental. The other is strategic." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking to be part of whatever comes after. I want no part of pack politics or council chambers or any of it. I want to keep my cottage and my dog and my quiet life. But you are here, and Aldrich doesn't know that, and a week is a manageable inconvenience compared to the alternative." Cale was quiet for a long moment. She had learned already that his silences were not empty. They were where he did his most significant thinking, the visible part of a process that ran deeper than the surface. "If Aldrich suspects," he said, "he will send men here. You understand what that means." "I understand." "You're human. You have no protection under pack law if—" "I have a large dog and a wood-cutting axe and 7 months of practice being underestimated," she said. "I'm not fragile. I'm just small." She paused. "Also, you'd be here, which I imagine is not nothing." Something moved at the corner of his mouth again. That same almost expression, controlled before it arrived. Davin cleared his throat. "I should return before I'm missed." He stood and looked at Cale with the particular look of a man who had many things to say and had decided this was not the moment for them. "I'll send word through the village route. The phrase will be different." "I know the system," Cale said. Davin nodded. He looked at Ellie with an expression that had moved, in the course of an hour, from neutral assessment to something that contained a degree of genuine consideration. "Thank you," he said, "for finding him. For what you did." "He was in the water," she said, which was the same answer she'd given Cale, and which meant the same thing, that she didn't need gratitude for the things she'd do regardless. Davin left. The cottage settled back into its ordinary quiet. Rain on the roof, fire in the hearth. Bramble returning to his position at Cale's feet, with the loyalty of a creature that had made a decision, and saw no reason to revisit it. Ellie stood and began clearing the table. "You don't have to do this," Cale said. "I've decided to," she said. "That's not the same as having to." "Ellie." She stopped. The sound of her name in his voice was different from most people's version of it. Lower, more deliberate, as though he was being careful with it. She turned. He was looking at her with the full, unguarded weight of his attention, which she was beginning to understand was a significant thing. That this man gave his attention the way other men gave oaths, with the understanding that it meant something. "I don't take lightly what you're risking," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." She turned back to the table. Outside, Davin's horse faded into the tree line. Inside, the fire said what neither of them would. The days that followed had a rhythm she hadn't expected. She had anticipated tension, the particular strain of sharing a small space with a powerful stranger. The hypervigilance of someone aware that everything had changed and might change further without warning. She had not anticipated the way it settled, gradually, into something that resembled the ordinary movement of two people negotiating a shared domestic space with mutual respect and a minimum of unnecessary words. Cale healed quickly. By the second day, he was moving without holding his ribs. By the third, he was at the table from early morning, and she had stopped insisting he rest because it was clearly producing the opposite effect. A contained restlessness that expressed itself in the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of a man actively preventing himself from moving. She brought him Thomas's old books instead, which he accepted without comment, and discovered he read with the same thoroughness he applied to everything, finishing each one and setting it aside in a precise stack. She worked around him. She had tasks. The cottage required maintenance. The small garden at the back needed clearing before the hard frost came. Firewood needed splitting. The first morning she'd taken the axe to the woodpile. She'd come back to find him at the window watching. And she'd ignored the watching because she'd learned that he observed the way some people breathed. Constantly, without apology, as a basic function, rather than an intrusion. On the fourth morning he came outside. "You should be resting," she said, without looking up from the root she was digging. "I've been resting for 3 days," he said. "My body is arguing against further rest." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was in Thomas's spare clothes again, the too short shirt, a pair of heavy work trousers she'd found folded at the bottom of the chest, boots that were his own, cleaned and dried. He looked profoundly out of place and entirely unself-conscious about it, which she found, against her better judgment, somewhat disarming. "Fine," she said. "The wood needs splitting." He split wood for 2 hours without stopping, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned physical labor early and kept it, and she worked in the garden and did not watch him mostly. At midday she brought bread and dried meat to the table outside, and they ate in the thin winter sunlight without speaking for a while, and Bramble lay between them stealing crusts, and the silence was the comfortable kind, which was the kind she trusted least, because she knew what it meant when silences stopped being careful. "Tell me about him," Cale said. She looked up. "Thomas? If you want to." She thought about deflecting. It would have been easy, a simple "there's not much to tell" and a return to the bread, but the offer was genuine, carefully made, with no pressure behind it, and she found that mattered. "He was a good man," she said. "Not dramatic about it. He didn't make speeches. He just did things. Quietly. Fixed what was broken. Showed up." She looked down at the bread in her hands. "I think I understood what I had more after than before. That's the part that stays." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like someone worth grieving properly." "Yes," she said. "He was." The simplicity of that exchange, the absence of platitude, the refusal to rush past the difficult thing, sat in her chest afterward in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was careful with it. That afternoon, Davin's message arrived through the village route, carried by a boy she recognized as the miller's son, who handed her a folded paper with the new phrase spoken quietly and correctly at the door. She brought it inside and read it at the table. Kyle read it after her. She watched his face as he did. It didn't change, but his hands did. A slight tension in the fingers, a barely perceptible increase in pressure on the paper. "Davin found the scribe," she said. "Yes. But there's something else." He looked up. "My head of household guard," he said after a moment. "A man named Corvin. He's been arrested on Aldrich's orders, accused of conspiracy against the crown. The charge is fabricated." A pause. "He's been in my service for 11 years. He has a wife and 3 children in the capital." Ellie read the rest of the message again. "Aldrich is using him as leverage," she said. "If you return and immediately move against him, Corvin suffers the consequences." "Aldrich understands how I work," Cale said. "He knows I won't sacrifice a loyal man." "Then he's built a cage, not just a trap." She set the paper down. "He wants you reactive. He wants you to come back furious and protective, and walk straight into whatever secondary position he's prepared." The look he gave her was not surprise. She'd established by now that surprise was not a primary feature of his responses, but it was recognition, and it was direct. "You think in strategy," he said. "I think in consequences," she said. Thomas used to say it was the same thing with different vanity. She stood and moved to the hearth because she needed to do something with her hands. "Aldrich has the scribe. Davin has the scribe's identity. That's a thread that unravels the forgery, but Corvin needs to be out before you pull that thread publicly, or Aldrich will cut him loose in the worst sense." She turned. "Is there someone in the capital you trust, who could move quietly?" "Not officially. Someone Aldrich wouldn't think to watch?" Cale was very still. "There is one person," he said slowly. "A woman named Sarah. She runs the household of an elderly council member. She has access to the lower levels of the administrative building and no official standing, which means no official scrutiny." "Can Davin reach her without going through any channel Aldrich monitors?" "Yes." "Then that's the sequence," Ellie said. "Sarah extracts Corvin quietly. Illness, transfer, whatever cover holds, before Davin moves against the scribe. Once Corvin is safe, the thread pulls. The forgery collapses. And then you walk into the council chamber with the evidence already in the room before you arrive." The silence afterward was long. "You walk in last," she added. "Not first. You let the evidence speak before you do, so that when you enter, the question of your stability is already answered. Aldrich's narrative collapses before he sees your face." Cal stood slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone whose body had opinions about standing, that his mind was overruling. He moved to the table and looked at the message again, then at her. "I came off a horse in a storm," he said. "That was the story." "Yes." "What did you tell the village?" "That a traveler had come off his horse in the storm and was recovering." She paused. "They didn't ask many questions. A widow taking in a traveler is unremarkable. I made sure to seem slightly embarrassed about it when I mentioned it, which made it even less interesting." Something moved through his expression. "You thought of that yourself, immediately," she said. "I'm not naive about what it looks like. A woman alone and a man in her house. Better to seem faintly foolish than suspicious." He looked at her for a long moment, with that full attention, the kind that didn't slide away, that made her aware of being seen completely and without reduction. "Ellie," he said. "Don't," she said. He paused. "Don't say whatever you're about to say," she clarified, keeping her voice even. "I know what this looks like from where you're standing. I know what I've done this week looks like more than it is. I'm being practical. I have reasons for that. Don't complicate them." "I wasn't going to complicate them," he said quietly. "I was going to ask if you were afraid." She hadn't expected that. She turned back to the fire and spent a moment with the question, honestly. "Yes," she said finally. "Not of Aldrich's men. Of the other thing." She didn't say what the other thing was. She didn't need to. He was perceptive enough to hear what wasn't said, and she suspected he already knew that the fear wasn't of violence, wasn't of politics or consequences. It was the older fear, the one that had been living quietly in her chest since the first morning she'd woken and found a changed silence in the room, one that felt different from grief, less like absence, more like presence. She was afraid of beginning to rely on someone again. She was afraid of what it would mean if she did. He didn't press. He went back to the chair by the window, and she went back to the hearth, and Bramble moved between them like a gray tide, unhurried and certain. That night, Davin's second message confirmed the sequence was in motion. Sarah had been contacted. Corvin's transfer was being arranged for the following morning under a fabricated medical order. The scribe had been located in a rented room above a tanner's shop in the capital's eastern district, and two of Davin's most trusted men were watching the building. Everything was in place. Cale would leave in 2 days. She read that part of the message twice, then folded the paper and set it in the fire and watched it take. 2 days. She had known it was temporary. She had structured her thinking around its temporariness deliberately, had kept the emotional accounting clean and bounded. She had done everything correctly. She lay in the chair that night. She'd continued to give him the bed, and he'd stopped arguing about it after the second day, which she suspected was because he'd noticed she slept better in the chair than she would have beside someone she was trying not to think about. And listened to the fire settle, and to Bramble's slow breathing, and to the slightly less labored rhythm of Cale's sleep across the room, and told herself that 2 days was manageable. Told herself it clearly enough that she almost believed it. He was gone before dawn on the 6th day. She woke to the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the careful, deliberate tread of someone trying not to disturb, which was somehow louder than ordinary walking, and lay still in the chair with her eyes open, and the gray dark of early morning pressing against the windows. She heard him at the table, the slight scrape of something being set down. Then the door opened quietly and closed with equal care, and the sound of a horse she hadn't heard arrive, Davin having come in silence, and then hoofbeats moving away through the trees. Gone. Bramble lifted his head from the floor, looked at the door, and then looked at her. "I know," she said. She got up and built the fire and did not look at the table for several minutes. When she did, she found a folded piece of paper weighted down with the silver ring, the heavy one with the black stone, the one she'd recognized as something significant and chosen not to name. She picked up the ring first. It was heavier than it looked, warm from being worn, the black stone catching the firelight in a way that made it seem briefly alive. She set it down and opened the paper. His handwriting was what she'd expected. Precise, spare, no flourish. The letters formed with the same controlled economy he applied to speech. "You will hear what happens in 3 days' time. When you do, know that what you made possible was not nothing. The ring is not payment. Consider it a marker of a debt that cannot be paid in the ordinary way. If you ever need anything, send it to Davin with the phrase, 'He will find me.' Thank you for the water, for the fire, for thinking in consequences." She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands and sat with the feeling for a moment, without trying to manage it or name it or put it neatly away. Thomas had taught her that some feelings deserved their moment before the practical mind came back in. She gave it its moment. Then she put the ring and the letter in the wooden box on the mantel where she kept the few things that mattered, and she went outside to split wood, and she did not cry, and Bramble walked at her heels, and that was enough. 3 days later, she heard. The miller's son came running up the path in the middle of the afternoon with the particular energy of someone carrying news too large for ordinary walking pace. He was breathless before he reached the door, and what he told her came out in fragments she had to assemble. The Alpha King, alive, returned to the capital, a council session that had apparently lasted most of the night, and ended with a lord named Aldrich, arrested on charges of conspiracy and attempted assassination, forged documents exposed, testimony from a scribe, 2 council members removed from their seats, a woman named Mira escorted from the capital under formal censure. The boy had it from his father, who had it from a merchant who had passed through the capital's eastern gate that morning. Ellie stood in her doorway and listened and felt the pieces settle. "Is the king well?" she asked. "They say so," the boy said. "They say he walked in alone, right into the middle of the session, without announcement, and the whole room went silent." The boy's eyes were wide with the pleasure of a good story. "They say Aldrich went white as a sheet." She imagined it. Kyle walking into that chamber, unhurried, controlled, the full weight of his presence arriving before any word was spoken, the council turning, Aldrich turning. The moment in which every carefully constructed lie met the simple, devastating fact of the man still breathing. Yes, she thought, that would do it. "Thank you," she told the boy, and gave him a coin and sent him back down the path with the satisfied haste of someone who had more news to deliver elsewhere. She went back inside. She stood in the middle of the cottage that had been hers and Thomas's, and then briefly something else. something she didn't have a clean word for, and looked at the space where he'd slept, the chair where he'd sat, the place at the table where his mug had been. "Good," she said, to no one in particular. Bramble wagged his tail. Life returned to its ordinary shape. She chopped wood and tended the garden, and walked to the village and read by firelight in the evenings. She was not unhappy. She had never been unhappy here, only occasionally aware of the dimensions of the quiet, the way it filled differently than it had when Thomas was alive. She had grown used to that particular fullness of absence. She had thought she was used to it. She found she had to get used to it again, which was irritating. And she allowed herself to be irritated about it for exactly as long as seemed fair. And then she stopped. 2 weeks after he left, the horse arrived. Not a message. A horse. A real one. A gray mare of evident quality, led up the path by a young man in a riding cloak, who handed her the reins, and a letter with the manner of someone who had been given very precise instructions and intended to follow them exactly. The letter was from Davin. His Majesty requests that you accept this in the spirit in which it is given, which is practical rather than presumptuous. He notes that a half-morning's walk to the village in winter is unreasonable, that the northeastern border requires more regular maintenance than a human woman alone can manage on foot, and that the mare's name is already settled as she was born to it, and will not answer to another. Her name is Nettle. She is well-tempered but opinionated, and will require someone equally opinionated to manage her. His Majesty believed you would be suited. He also asks, if you are willing, whether you would receive a visitor in approximately 10 days. Ellie stood in her doorway holding the letter, looking at the mare, who was looking back at her with large amber eyes and the expression of an animal that had already decided this arrangement was satisfactory. "Nettle," Ellie said. The mare's ears moved forward. "Opinionated," she said to Bramble, who was circling the horse with intense investigative energy. He said opinionated. "Está," she wrote back through the young man, who waited with the patience of someone accustomed to it. Her reply was brief. She said the mare was accepted in the practical spirit intended. She said 10 days was fine. She did not say anything else, because anything else would have been the beginning of a conversation she wasn't sure how to have by letter. He came on the 10th day, alone, without ceremony, in a riding cloak that was his own this time, dark wool, good quality, bearing no damage, on a black horse that Nettle greeted with the recognition of animals that knew each other. He dismounted at the gate, and she was already outside because Bramble had told her he was coming 3 minutes before she could have known it by any other means. He looked at her across the gate. She looked at him. He was fully himself again, healed, rested, the shadows gone from beneath his eyes, standing with the unforced authority that was simply his natural condition. And yet he was also, she noticed, slightly less composed than he had been in the council chamber descriptions she'd imagined. There was something in the set of his jaw, the particular quality of stillness around him, that she recognized now as what it looked like when he was being careful about something. "You came," she said. "I said I would. You said approximately. 10 days is approximately 10 days. She opened the gate. They walked, eventually, to the oak grove north of the cottage where she'd found him. She'd suggested it without entirely knowing why, and he'd agreed without asking, and stood for a while at the edge of the shallow ravine where the stream ran clean and cold over the mossy stones. "Corvin is well?" he said. "His family is well. Aldrich will stand trial in the spring." "Mira," a pause, level and unsentimental, "has been given the choice to return to her family's territory. She took it." Another pause. "The council is intact. The 2 removed members have been replaced by people whose loyalties I understand clearly." "Good," she said. "There is one other thing." She looked at him. He turned from the stream and looked at her with the full, unguarded weight of that attention. Not the controlled version, the managed version, but something beneath it, something she hadn't seen yet, which was the Alpha King setting down the parts of himself that were public and letting the private parts speak. "I am aware," he said carefully, "of what I'm asking. I'm aware of what you've been through and what trust means to you and what it costs. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm not asking you to be anything you're not, or to step into a world you didn't choose, or to set aside your grief before it's ready to be set aside. He paused. I'm asking if I can come back, he said. That's all. Just back. To this gate, this path, this fire, to Bramble and the insufferably opinionated mare. The corner of his mouth moved, to you thinking in consequences and telling me not to complicate things. Ellie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, not with grief, or not only with grief, but with the particular fullness of having loved someone well and been loved in return, and knowing that such a thing was real and possible, and did not, when it ended, mean it couldn't exist again in different form. She thought about the morning she'd gone down the bank toward a man who might have been dangerous, and how the decision had been made not from foolishness, but from the clearest part of herself, the part that knew what it was and acted accordingly. She thought about Bramble, who was currently sitting pressed against Cale's leg, with the serene certainty of a creature that had known from the first moment what this would become. Yes, she said, not dramatically. Not with tears or declarations or the elaborate vocabulary of romance. Just yes. Plainly. In the way that she did things. The way Thomas had taught her and life had reinforced, which was to say the true thing simply and let it be enough. Something in Cale's face settled. Not relief exactly. Deeper than relief. Quieter. The expression of a man who had learned not to assume things would go as he needed them to, and had been proven wrong in the best way. He didn't close the distance between them. Not yet. He turned back to the stream, and she stood beside him, and they watched the cold water move over the stones, and Bramble sighed enormously, and lay down across both their feet. It was months before she stood in the Capitol for the first time, at Cale's side in the great hall, with the council assembled and the pack lords present and the full formal weight of the high pack watching. She wore deep green wool, and her dark hair pinned with a small silver piece he'd given her in the cottage one quiet evening. Not a crown. Not yet. But something. And she stood straight, and looked at the room with the same clear steadiness she'd applied to everything since she was old enough to understand that the world underestimated quiet women, and that this was a structural advantage. Cale introduced her without performance. No grand speech, no theater. He said her name and said she was his, and the simplicity of it, the same economy he brought to everything, made it more significant than any formal declaration could have been. She became his Luna before the winter was out. Not because destiny had arranged it, or because a bond had overruled her choice, but because she had chosen it, fully, with open eyes, with the knowledge of what choosing cost and what it was worth, and with Bramble present at the ceremony, which Cale had insisted on, and which had earned him, in her private accounting, a permanent and irrevocable regard. Aldrich stood trial in the spring, and was stripped of rank and territory, and exiled beyond the pack borders. The two council members who had supported his forgery faced the same. Mira did not return. The scribe, in exchange for full testimony, was given a reduced sentence and relocated under supervision to a border settlement, where he apparently took up carpentry, and caused no further trouble. Corvin returned to service. His children grew up knowing the Alpha King by name, and without fear, which Cale considered, when she pointed it out, one of the better outcomes of the whole affair. The cottage on the northeastern border was kept. She insisted on that. Cale had offered to staff it, maintain it, turn it into something formal, and she'd declined. It remained as it was, small and slightly drafty, with the creak in the third floorboard and the window that needed a particular technique to fully close and the woodpile she'd stacked herself through the first winter of her widowhood. They went back to it sometimes, in the autumn, when the capital was loud with politics and the forest was quiet with cold. They brought Nettle and the black horse and Bramble, who was aging now but still enormous, and still thoroughly convinced of his own adequacy as a guardian. She would sit on the step in the early morning with her hands around a mug of tea, listening to the pines, and Cale would come and sit beside her without speaking. And the silence between them was the kind she had learned to love, the kind that wasn't empty, that was full of everything they'd chosen and kept choosing, every day, without ceremony. The kind that smelled, at last, not like grief, but like wood smoke and pine and the particular warmth of a fire that someone else had thought to build before you woke, like home.